In the arid heart of Spain, between silent hills and golden fields, rests the small town of Belchite, a place where time seems to have been forgotten, with ancient ruins whispering stories of past wars. But lately, something much darker has been lurking among its inhabitants. It all began on a cold autumn night. The sky, usually speckled with bright stars, was unusually dark. Strange lights danced over the mountains, moving erratically, as if obeying invisible logic. The older residents recalled ancient legends of the Watchers, entities that lurk in the shadows, but no one wanted to believe that such a thing could be real. Then the disappearances began. First was Antonio, a farmer known for never leaving his property after sunset. His neighbors found his tractor abandoned in the middle of the field, the engine still warm, but there was no trace of him. Then came Marta, a young teacher, last seen walking toward her house after work. Her scarf was found hanging on a fence, as if it had been ripped off with force. The town fell into an oppressive atmosphere of fear. The streets, once lively, became deserted as night fell. No one dared to go out after the sun disappeared below the horizon. But the worst was yet to come. One night, Javier, the owner of a small local bar, shared something that chilled everyone to the bone. He said he saw a tall, thin figure on the other side of the road. The skin seemed translucent under the faint light of the lantern, and its eyes, large, black, empty eyes, stared at him for a long moment before the creature disappeared into the darkness. Similar reports began to surface. Shadows moving at the edges of the town, sharp sounds echoing through the hills, and a strange feeling of being watched, even when alone at home. Some believed these were just hallucinations fueled by collective fear. Others, however, began to investigate. A small group, led by Diego, a local journalist, ventured into mountains in a desperate attempt to find answers. What they discovered was beyond what the human mind could endure. In a cave hidden between the rocks, they found unknown symbols carved into the walls, glowing with a bluish hue. There were also strange devices, which seemed to pulse as if alive. And in the center of the cave, a semi-open metallic capsule, empty. Before they could react, a presence made itself felt. A shadow emerged in the darkness. A tall being with unnaturally long limbs and eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. Diego and his group ran, but not all of them returned. The news was silenced by local authorities, who claimed it was a group of frightened youths who mistook ancient symbols for something supernatural. But the inhabitants of Belchite knew the truth. They still hear the sharp sounds on silent nights. They still feel the invisible eyes watching from the shadows. As the months went by, the fear in Belchite did not diminish. On the contrary, it deepened, becoming a constant presence, like the icy wind cutting to the hills at night. The inhabitants began to unite, searching for answers, trying to understand what was happening in their small town. Some turned to old books of history and legends, trying to find something that could explain the inexplicable events. But nothing seemed to fit. With each new disappearance, the town grew emptier. People became more distrustful, and desolation took over the streets. The authorities, unable to provide a logical explanation, began to distance themselves further, ignoring the pleas of the residents. The local police insisted that the disappearances were just coincidences, but no one believed that anymore. Some even suggested that the ruins of Belchite might be responsible, while others hinted that the entities were older, more complex than anyone could imagine. Meanwhile, a new phenomenon began to develop. On the darkest nights, a strange fog would descend on the town. It moved gently, as if it had a mind of its own, and each night it grew denser, covering the streets and fields with a thick mantle. No one dared to venture out when the fog arrived. It was said that if you looked directly at it, you could feel a pressure, as if something was trying to enter your mind. Many spoke of constant nightmares, seeing things that couldn't be seen, but that seemed real enough to terrorize their minds. One such night, a group of brave residents decided to confront the fog. They gathered in front of the old church, each carrying a lantern, feeling a strange sensation in the air. When the fog finally enveloped them, a cold calmness took over. The temperature dropped drastically, and for a moment, no one dared to speak, until suddenly a deep, vibrating sound broke the silence, as if something immense and unknown was moving within the fog. It was then that, through the thick mist, they saw it, a figure not human, but with forms that defied logic, its contours distorting as though made of vapor. It approached them, but without taking a single step. The eyes that formed in the void of the fog seemed to penetrate each of their thoughts, and one of them, Jose, had a terrifying vision of his own death. He screamed and tried to run, but the rest of the group remained paralyzed, unable to move. That night was marked by a feeling of loss, as if something was being torn from Belchite, something irreversible. When the fog dissipated with the dawn, only 3 people had returned. Jose, the youngest of the group, had vanished. The others couldn't explain what they had seen, but they knew that what they were facing was not human. Over the weeks that followed, more people began to report seeing figures similar to the one Jose had described, and even children spoke about the eyes in the dark. A collective fear took over the town to the point that, even during the day, the inhabitants constantly looked over their shoulders, expecting something to be watching them. 1 month after Jose's disappearance, Diego, the journalist, tried to find a more scientific explanation for the events. He immersed himself in the town's old documents, studying the history of Belchite and its wars, its legends, and even astronomical observations. During one of his investigations, he found something that froze his stomach. In the town hall files, there were mentions of an ancient expedition led by the Spanish military, a secret expedition that took place in the 1940s, shortly after the Spanish Civil War. The expedition was vaguely described, but it mentioned something about inexplicable phenomena and non-human entities. One of the documents said that the expedition had been interrupted after a series of mysterious disappearances and deaths, but no one knew for sure what had happened. The strangest thing of all was the discovery that Belchite, during the war, had been a point of interest for scientific and military research, trying to understand the presence of strange signals coming from the mountains and from space. The documents indicated that the signals were not natural, but came from something far beyond human understanding. With this, Diego began piecing together the puzzle, and the conclusion he reached was terrifying. What was happening in Belchite was not just an isolated phenomenon or a forgotten legend. Something from another world was connected to the town, and that explained the disappearances and the figures that had been seen. Desperate, he searched for more information about the Watchers, those beings mentioned in the legends. He discovered that, throughout the centuries, many civilizations around the world had similar accounts of beings who appeared in the shadows, watching people, communicating in incomprehensible ways. One theory suggested that these beings were not simply visitors, but part of a cosmic network, something that transcended human understanding, as if they existed on a different plane, yet still deeply interconnected with ours. That night, Diego decided to go to the cave where the group had made their discovery. He felt that there lay the key to understanding what was happening. When he arrived, everything was quieter than he had ever imagined. The metallic capsule was still there, but now it seemed in perfect condition, as if time had been suspended around it. He approached cautiously, feeling the pressure in the air increase as he neared. Something was watching him, something much bigger than he could imagine. Suddenly, the earth began to tremble, and an immense shadow appeared before him. It was as though space-time itself was distorting, giving rise to something that should not exist. Diego had no time to react, as the being materialized before him, its black eyes locking onto him with a penetrating gaze. A strange voice, like a whisper in his mind, resonated. "You are the last. There is no time left." And then, in the blink of an eye, everything went dark. The next morning, Belchite awoke with an even more oppressive feeling. Another resident had disappeared. And this time, no one seemed willing to speak about the events. But everyone knew in their hearts that what was happening there was no ordinary mystery. Something alien, something from beyond, was taking over Belchite, and what remained of the town was about to be erased. And as the fog spread once more, the town could only wait for one thing: whether the terror that had taken hold would finally be understood, or if perhaps it was already too late to understand anything at all. From that moment on, the sense of desperation in Belchite transformed into something deeper, more terrifying. The inhabitants, now few and increasingly isolated, began to distance themselves from each other. The town, which had once been a gathering place for stories and traditions, now seemed desolate, where the whispers of the past and the silence of the present merged. The houses were empty, the markets lifeless, and even the fields seemed to be waiting for something. The only sound that remained was the whisper of the fog, which seemed to live on its own. With each dawn, more people disappeared, as if the town was being slowly consumed. Some began to leave Belchite, fleeing to distant places, but it seemed there was no escape. Even for those who ventured across the mountains or took the road, fear pursued them. They said that at night, they could feel the presence of the fog sliding over them, as if the hills were filled with invisible eyes watching their attempts to flee. However, something changed that night, something no one could have foreseen. When the fog arrived in the town with its usual thickness, something in the air felt different. A great light appeared on the horizon, initially small, but soon expanding, illuminating the land with a strange and metallic glow. The inhabitants, terrified yet curious, gathered in the town square, gazing at the sky as the winds brought a foreboding of imminent death. The light in the sky approached, not in a natural way, but with a circular, controlled movement, as if something was directing it. The low, resonating sound grew louder as the light descended. The inhabitants began to murmur, recognizing the peculiarity of what was happening. Some whispered it was a return of the Watchers. Others feared it was the beginning of the end of Belchite. It was then that something colossal descended, something that defied all human logic or explanation. A craft, but not like any other. It didn't have the usual shiny metal forms or engines pulsing with energy. It was a vast structure made up of geometric shapes that seemed to stretch and change positions as they touched the ground. It stood in the center of the town with a deep sound, as if the very laws of physics had been bent by its presence. Inside the craft, through its translucent walls, something could be seen moving. They weren't human figures, but strange beings with distorted shapes, undefined contours, and immense eyes that reflected the light in a hypnotic way. Fear spread among the few survivors of Belchite, and many fell to their knees, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The idea of extraterrestrials from another galaxy seemed too simple an explanation for what the human eyes were seeing. As the craft ascended, the Watchers began to appear in the streets, their forms taking on the density of the fog. With their piercing eyes, watching with a chilling calmness. Some started to scream, asking for help, trying to run, but something stopped them. It was as if the entire town was being dragged into that distorted reality. A sense of inevitability took hold of everyone who remained. They were trapped, not just physically, but in a nightmare for which they couldn't wake. It was then that the truth came to light, a truth far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. The Watchers were not simply observers or messengers from another world. They were, in fact, interdimensional entities, capable of manipulating space-time and human perception. The town of Belchite, with its history of war and destruction, had been chosen as a convergence point between multiple dimensions, a portal of interaction between parallel realities. And the Watchers were the guardians of that portal. When the sky filled with the intense light of the craft, the town fell into an absolute silence. There was no sound, no whisper of the fog, no desperate screams. Only the immense presence of these beings floating over Belchite remained. It was as if time in that instant had been suspended. But then, something even more disturbing happened. The ground beneath Belchite began to crack open, with deep fissures cutting through the streets, while an invisible force dragged the buildings and structures into the darkness. The people still resisted, trying to understand what was happening, but soon they realized that the town was being torn from existence, erased from all memories, as if it had never existed. Meanwhile, Diego, who had disappeared weeks earlier, appeared once more, but now he was no longer the man he had been. He had taken on a completely altered form, his eyes black and lifeless, with an empty expression, as if he had been deeply transformed by the alien presence. He looked at the few who remained and, with a voice that seemed to resonate across multiple dimensions at once, said, "There is no turning back. The reality you knew no longer exists." With those words, the fissures deepened even further, and the town, now completely enveloped by the fog, was consumed by an intense light. It was as if Belchite had been swallowed by a black hole, a final distortion in the fabric of reality. In an instant, nothing remained but an empty field, covered by a thick fog that slithered on endlessly. The legends of Belchite now were more than just stories. They were warnings. What had happened in that small town, lost in the heart of Spain, was not the end of a mere village, but a conclusion of a cosmic phenomenon that could extend far beyond the borders of that patch of land. Something had been awakened, something that could no longer be contained. And Belchite, the city forgotten by history, had been the portal that opened the doors to the unknown. The last to leave, before the light consumed them, heard one final message in their minds. The conclusion of the cycle is near. What began here will eventually reach all of you. And then, like a whisper in the wind, Belchite ceased to exist, taking with it the secrets that would never be revealed.